Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 23rd, where I wanted to continue talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if you will see in the notes below, I have also given an extension for that first paper. The first paper being on one of the first sets of readings that we're doing over the course of the semester. So that would be either Frankenstein or Poe's short stories or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But we aren't going to be finishing our conversation about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde until next class. So if it turns out that you wanted a little bit more time, that's fine by me. I've extended it until Monday the 30-ish, and I add ish at the ending because, as you know, I have rolling due dates. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted in your paper. And that I've chosen approximately midway through the semester as the due date, because by that point you would want to have your first major assignment submitted in, I would think. But certainly if you don't have it by the 30th, let me know where you are in terms of the process. Basically, I just evaluate the papers in order of receipt, and I evaluate the papers for grammar and mechanics as well as for content, and then put a letter grade on that, return that back to you. If you are content with your grade, you're done with the assignment. But if it turns out that you want to revise, you are certainly encouraged to do so. I ask that you incorporate my suggestions into your revision, and if you need further direction, please feel free to reach out to me. And your revision would be due by the ending of the semester, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And certainly I'll get your paper back to you before the ending of the semester so that you've got time to revise if you so wanted to. And your second paper is going to be very similar to what you've done with the first paper, but just with the second half of the semester's readings as options to write about. And that would be due at the very ending of the semester, so you probably wouldn't have time to revise it, but I would think you wouldn't need to revise it because the first paper is the learning exercise. So once you've gone through that particular exercise, you should already have an understanding of how to write a paper. So the second paper would just be duplicating what you did with the first paper, but with a different reading, of course. Now, that said, I have had students who've submitted in their papers early enough so that we could negotiate the possibility of a revision for the second paper. But we do have to negotiate. It depends on when you submit it and due dates and lots of other factors as well. But everybody has the option of revising the first paper. And again, you've got up until the ending of the semester to submit in your revision. I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments along with your revision so I can compare and contrast the two. So you should be submitting your paper via PDF to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And that's really how my grading program works best, through PDF. So that's why I'm requesting that. And again, I thank those of you who've already submitted in papers, and I will just work my way through the papers, not just for this class, but for the other classes as well. And where we are is we saw a film version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, very iconic film version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's usually considered to be, if not the definitive version, a definitive version. And it's very different from the text. This is something that we have seen before, but even more so, I think, with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, just because of the subtext that's embedded within the novella. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is classified as a novella, which means that it is longer than a short story, so it's longer than Poe's works. But it isn't as long as a novel, so it's not as long as Shelley's works. And the last attendance question, I had asked you, why do you think the film deviates so much from the novel? And many of you speculated about the length of the novel. But honestly, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is not a terribly long tale. It probably could have been translated over in just about its entirety into film. The bigger issue is the mode of storytelling, Once again, we see the epistolary novel. It's something that we saw with Frankenstein. Notice that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is told through letters. And also, what we will see is that the text is basically examining some of the hypocrisies associated with Victorian society, especially surrounding sexuality. And that said, usually Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has been seen as an examination of queer impulse in a society that really frowned upon sexuality for any other reason outside of procreation. And so understanding the morals of the and the hypocrisies of Victorian society will definitely help us understand this particular text. Notice that it usually is condensed, the title, just like Frankenstein had a much longer title talking about the modern Prometheus. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is really the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And we basically have a mystery story, very appropriate since it was Edgar Allan Poe actually was credited with creating the modern day mystery story, the modern day detective story. But a strange case can also suggest a medical issue, and definitely that's one of the themes that is embedded within the text. Disease, whether it be physical or emotional or a combination thereof. And Dr. Jekyll, notice his title of doctor, especially during this time period. Remember, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came out in 1886. This was probably the profession that illustrated the height of respectability, a doctor. But we are told at the very beginning that he was wild in his youth. So this gives us a sense of the overly simplistic way that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is oftentimes viewed, that Jekyll is good and Hyde is bad. It isn't quite that simple. If Jekyll, the good part of this individual, had wild impulses in his youth and still has impulses to act upon some of the forbidden activities of his society, then we can't say that he's completely good, can we? The last name Jekyll is interesting in Danish. It means an icicle. And we can think about the idea of being frozen or cold, not allowing oneself to show emotion or show passion, which was definitely the idea behind Victorian society. It was all about decorum. It was all about appearances. And again, sexuality was purely within marriage for the purpose of procreation, not pleasure. However, Victorian society also had a thriving prostitution trade and quite a problem with sexually transmitted diseases. So you can see that it was a society that was filled with hypocrisy. And the daytime in Victorian society was a time of respectability, but the nighttime was seen as a time of sort of unsavory activities. Dr. Jekyll is contrasted with the Mr. Hyde. The Mr. just being for male. And this is definitely a very male-centric novel. There are just about no females in this particular text. Obviously, Mr. has no real status at this point in society, in time and in society, the way it would have used to have had when somebody was a gentleman, let's say, back during Shakespeare's time. That said, we also get the sense that because this is such a male-centric novel, and because we aren't told the specific activities that Mr. Hyde is engaging in, that we can perhaps surmise that there is queer subtext in some of his desires. And I'll continue with showing some ways that is perhaps suggested over the course of the novel. Hide, of course, is to conceal something, to hide something. Hide is also an animal skin. I think that works so nicely because this text is really showing our inner natures, which is oftentimes more bestial or animalistic than we would care to admit. Hide in Danish means a heaven, or a haven, I'm sorry. Again, a place where one can find relief or find sanctuary. And we're told a little bit about Hyde's appearance in the novel, that it's displeasing. And he's pale and he's dwarfish. Notice he's smaller. Perhaps the idea is that evil diminishes an individual. Troglodyte. actually is the word that's used. There is the suggestion of a kind of reverse Darwinism, a regression back into the bestial. There's lots of references to doors and windows, and might I suggest that both of them serve as entrances and exits, especially to the psyche. This is very much a psychological text. And keep this in mind when we talk about a text such as The Exorcist, where in the film version at the very least, the door to the girl's room, her name is Regan MacNeil, is so prominently displayed. Again, the idea that we're entering into another reality. We're entering into evil, in effect. So, our narrator, Mr. Gabriel John Utterson. Now, to utter is to tell, and that's exactly what Utterson does, as he utters or he tells us the tale. Gabriel is a Christian archangel. And again, think about the subtext in this piece about trying to maintain decorum and Puritan ideology. And Utterson seems to do that, but he comes off as a very unattractive character. I say he seems to do that because he does spend some time with some perhaps unsavory individuals, including Dr. Jekyll. So even that suggests that perhaps there's another element to his personality. When we get a character like Dr. Hasty Lanyon, and we'll be hearing his version of the story. Notice we get stories embedded within stories, like we did with Frankenstein. You might say that he's a little bit too hasty. He quickly judges Jekyll. The action takes place on Queer Street. Now, queer can mean odd, but I also looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is considered the dictionary of all dictionaries because it offers historical usages of words with examples from literary texts, going all the way back to the earliest texts that can be documented to use that word, which for the OED, queer would have been a sexual reference in the early 1900s. Now, that said, I know that this text takes place in 1886, but there usually is a time lag before language moves from oral tradition into written tradition. And certainly there is a time lag before language is usually accepted into dictionaries and into common usage. So perhaps there is also that reference to the sexual reference. The homoerotic references in the text, outside of having a story on Queer Street about just bachelors, Sir Danver Carrow's murder, and we aren't given the details of it, but one suspects that that in one way or another it has something to do with a thwarted romantic relationship and the possibility of blackmail. And in fact, blackmail is something that's mentioned in this text in other contexts. We're also told that the experiments that Dr. Jekyll engages in to become Mr. Hyde, his lab needs to be accessed through the back door. And the back door, again, can be a euphemism for the idea of homosexual sex. Now, the movies usually give us a romantic love story that is heterosexual, not too surprising considering the expectations of the time period. And we are usually presented with what is very common for female in film during this time, and maybe even still today, the two extremes of the whore or the Madonna, which is what we saw in the Frederick March version, either the angelic perfect female or the fallen female, and nothing in between. This text is also quite psychological, and even though Sigmund Freud didn't come up with his theories until 1923, I think you can see how the text examines things such as id, ego, and superego. And if you're not familiar with Freud's theories of id, ego, and superego, he had talked about how we all have three elements to our personality. And the id is the bestial, is the instinctual, and the superego is conscience. And the ego basically serves as the middle man between the two, so to speak, trying to balance the two. So many pieces of literature, both in and outside of the Gothic tradition, are about trying to maintain balance. We talked about how the Gothic oftentimes talks about twos or doubles, or the idea of duplicity, which is also another kind of two. And we definitely see that in this particular tale. This is a house with two doors, the front and the back. Notice that the house has no window, no bell, no knocker. The idea that it's supposed to try to isolate the individual. We know already with just the little bit of reading that we've done that isolation is usually a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. There was in the Victorian society, perhaps even in today's society, two extremes of wealth and poverty, and it was quite possible that they could coexist side by side, a very wealthy neighborhood with a very impoverished neighborhood. There's obviously the two personas of Jekyll and Hyde. Notice that he dies as Hyde, unlike how many of the films portray it. There are two handwritings that we are exposed to, which is one of the clues that we're given in terms of being able to differentiate the two personalities. We have Dr. Lanyon's letter to Utterson. So there's an interior letter. Upon Jekyll's death or disappearance, it's supposed to be opened, that epistolary idea. And then, of course, we get Dr. Jekyll's narrative to Utterson as well. The Victorian society, just to give you a little bit of a taste of what it would have been like. At the very beginning of the story, they talk about Hyde attacking a little girl, and that would be the ultimate in a horrific crime, a little girl representing youth and innocence. But I think the response is even more interesting, that killing Hyde was out of the question, so they threatened him with scandal. Notice their first go-to is murder, and the second, that scandal could be akin in many ways to murder. It would be the death of one's reputation, one's personality. Utterson is a bachelor, as are all of our major characters. He's a lawyer who's never lighted by a smile. Again, he's not presented as a attractive character, one that we should try to emulate. He avoided the enjoyment of theaters and vintages. In fact, oftentimes the theater was seen as a kind of sinful pursuit. He retired gratefully to bed at the ending of the day. And he would dutifully walk with Mr. Enfield, even though he didn't necessarily want to, but felt that it was his responsibility. But despite all of that deprivation in his life, perhaps Utterson is living vicariously through keeping company with other individuals who have more, shall we say, questionable lifestyles, or as is stated in the text, that Utterson had a tolerance for others. At one point, Enfield says that he didn't want to ask any probing questions out of delicacy. Again, the idea that the Victorian society understanding was that one didn't delve in too deeply into hidden secrets. It was very much a time of facades, and that's basically what Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's house is. It's a Dr. Jekyll Hyde that's a facade for the ugly back. Now, violence in the text, we see the trampling of the girl who's supposed to represent innocence on a black winter morning. Again, that helps to set that Gothic mood. And again, Sir Danvers carry murder with ape-like fury. And again, just the reference to ape-like fury, a kind of reverse Darwinism. Even though the Frederick March movie was still in the early days of cinema, though, it's rather risque. And we get to see a little bit of flesh, and we also get some suggestions of S&M. So that's not to say that Hollywood didn't take its risks as well, but it decided that it couldn't go past a certain boundary. Now, I've tried to argue that all of these texts that I've selected for this semester have at least the possibility of supernatural. In fact, that's one of the elements of the Gothic, is that there is usually some ambiguity as to whether or not the events could have really taken place or could have some sort of supernatural element, something that defies the natural order. We also talked about genres, how science fiction and supernatural fiction oftentimes share elements, but science fiction is usually put in the future, and the supernatural is oftentimes examining the sins of the past. Science fiction is also possible through the use of science. Our science just hasn't gotten up to that point yet, as opposed to the supernatural, something that could not be possible with science because it defies the natural order. So when we see this, we can think about how Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in some ways, is like Frankenstein, is that it seems to straddle both genres. And I had argued with Frankenstein that the elements of the supernatural would be that Victor was spending time with transcendental teachings and with Cornelius Agrippa, who was known as an occultist during the time period, and thinking about the Philosopher's Stone, this supernatural I guess talisman, for lack of a better word, that could bring eternal life. In terms of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it perhaps is the hardest text to find a supernatural possibility. We talked a little bit with Poe that definitely Poe is a master of examining the psychological, and it's easy enough to find psychological explanations, especially when we're dealing with madness. But one of the things that I appreciated with Poe, or at least with the stories that I selected from Poe, is that there is still the possibility of supernatural occurrences. I wouldn't say that it's one or the other. I'd like to think both. In terms of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there is a reference to salt, and salt is very important in the supernatural tradition. Salt is supposed to purify against evil. You might have noticed that the potion that Dr. Jekyll makes to become Mr. Hyde has an impure salt, so he's unable to duplicate it. So if salt purifies, an impure salt would be something that would be evil. And I would suggest that the reference to salt is enough possibility for reference to the supernatural so that we could include it in the Gothic. That, and even just the text that I ordered for class with a foreword by Stephen King, very famous author in the Gothic tradition. He paired Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein, and Dracula together into one text. Those are usually considered the three seminal texts. The purpose of the book is one of the things that I'm going to ask you to contemplate for our next attendance question, which will be due this Wednesday. And I'll mention this again, but I wanted to talk a little bit about contemporary relevance and how you think this text might have contemporary relevance today. What do you think is its major message? It oftentimes has been read as a parable about drug addiction and one being able to, or not being able to, control one's addiction. I had earlier suggested that it was about repression or even about sexuality, which is oftentimes associated with repression. There also is this element of this serving as a morality tale, that ultimately he dies in the end as Hyde, that if one engages in evil, this is ultimately how one is going to meet one's maker and enter into the afterlife. So in terms of next class, as I had indicated, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Jekyll and Hyde, some of the quotations in there, and also begin Dracula. Now, I can tell you that Dracula is the longest text, probably the most challenging text because it is the longest text. But I think of Dracula as being multiple texts, which I will address next class. So if you can think of it that way, then perhaps it's a little bit more manageable. It's no mistake that Dracula happens to fall right around the time of Halloween. It's probably the perfect text for Halloween. And we definitely have a supernatural entity when we are talking about a vampire and we're talking about Dracula. And we will watch performance of Dracula as we have watched performance of other pieces. And we will also have a class coming up that's devoted just to Halloween. And I don't really want to say much about that class outside of just tune in. And I hope you will find it to be interesting and engaging. But prior to that class, there is a Halloween presentation that I am going to be part of at the Lava Center, which is an art center on Main Street in Greenfield, 324 Main Street to be exact. And this will be Sunday on the 29th at 7 p.m., where there's going to be a screening of a very famous horror film, Night of the Living Dead, which was written, directed, filmed, and edited by George Romero. And there will also be a discussion afterwards that I will be facilitating. And I will also be sharing some of a draft chapter that I've been working on for my in progress book that I've mentioned to you earlier, that's entitled Ticket to Terror, A Cultural Lens on Horror Film. Or at least that's the working title. Costumes are encouraged, and yes, I will be there in costume. Though on Monday, and that'll be the 30th, is when we will have our Halloween class. So if you wanted, and it won't be about Night of the Living Dead, that I can tell you. So if you wanted to go to the Lava Center, you won't be in any way spoiling what will be discussed on Monday. But just note that we will be able to begin Dracula, and then we'll have to put a pause on it as we talk about Halloween. And then we can return again to Dracula. Though that's not necessarily a bad thing, because ultimately, again, it is our longest novel. And you can see that I've included a link to Dracula. Whenever possible, I will give you links to the text, just like I was able to provide you with the link to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So our attendance question, which would be due this Wednesday, and of course, if you need an extension, please let me know. I'll be happy to grant it to you. Which element of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde do you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, and why? Which element do you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, and why? So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will put some closure onto Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. So in the event, if you haven't finished it, this is the time to finish it. And also begin Dracula. And of course, keep in mind, paper number 1. Take care. Bye-bye.